So, we're now here to discuss the multiple hurdle approach to testing. So, you may ask, what is a multiple hurdle approach? It's pretty simple. You probably did some in grade school. Let's imagine the first test is a spelling test, and your teacher grades you on the spelling test. And those who pass the spelling test, they get to take the math test. Those who don't pass the spelling test, they don't. That's a multiple hurdle. You have to pass one test to move on to the next stage, and so on and so on. Multiple hurdle test scores typically are not combined, they're used separately. Okay, so multiple hurdle tests have numerous advantages and disadvantages. Say, for example, you have a large applicant population and you need to thin them down. In this case, multiple hurdle approach may make a lot of sense where you give people the first test and then whoever passes that moves to the next and the next. So it makes a more efficient process. There are some downside to multiple hurdle approaches as well. For example, if you have a small group of applicants or test takers and they take the test and 50% of them pass, now you have 50% of a small group. So as you move through the test hurdles, each group by definition gets smaller and smaller. So understanding the adverse impact of a test may impact the order that you give it. For example, if you have three tests and one of them has higher adverse impact than the others, you may choose to use it as the last test. This gives the people more opportunity to pass the earlier tests and may reduce your overall adverse impact. So, the order of tests can have a huge impact on your testing system. So, it's important to choose tests that make sense in the way that they are delivered. For example, you may use a less expensive test or a more available test or an easier to administrate test as your first test. A lot of companies, as you move through testing, it becomes more and more challenging in terms of the testing and the cost. So many companies use their cheaper test up front. Then they may bring people on site or whatever, but use tests that cost more money as the next test. And then the third test may be interviews, which are quite expensive to deliver. Okay, so now we're going to give you an example of a multiple hurdle test battery. In this example, we've used three tests. The first test is a cognitive test, followed by a situational judgment test, and finally, an assessment center. Since it's a multiple hurdle process, you'll see that the sample size falls off as you move through. So let's look at this first example. Total number of applicants is 100. So this is indicating that 100 people took the cognitive abilities test. Now let's look at the overall outcomes for this. So we'll scroll down and notice on the findings page that for this test, 80% rule there were violations for Hispanic and Latinos, but not for the Fisher's exact test. Now that was at the overall cut score. When we break it down by decile, you'll notice that these different groups have different patterns for adverse impact. This can really impact how you interpret the use of the test and which test to use. In this example, the cognitive ability test has a pretty good bit of adverse impact, and it might be more practical to use it later in the test battery. Now we're moving to the second hurdle in the process. You can see the results. There's almost no adverse impact here. But look at the impact on your sample size. Remember that 20 people failed the cognitive abilities test. So out of the 100, we have 80 left here. So the results that you will see down below are based on the 80 people in this sample. So as you can see from the results of the situational judgment test analyses, there's no adverse impact. So this test is probably fair in its use. Now we're looking at assessment center results, and you'll notice that for this group, there was adverse impact on the 80% rule for both ethnicity and age. As you notice as well, this group is down to 63 applicants. So of all the people who've come through the last three, 63 participated in this round. As we move down to the finding sheet, that the overall pattern for 40 and under, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, and Asian resulted in adverse impact for the 80% rule, but not for the Fisher's exact test. Below this, you can see the chart of adverse impact results for different groups across the different deciles. The final report is the overall multiple hurdle report. As you notice, overall, we do have adverse impact for the 8% rule for both ethnicity and age. As we scroll down through this report, you'll notice that it's overall report so that there are 100 applicants here. So we've gone back to the group of 100 and looked at the impact across the test scores. For the finding sheet, you'll find a pattern of 80% rule impacts, but no Fisher exact impacts. Now, this particular report is different from the other three. It has a lot less information. The reason is that it's not an actual test. It's looking at the overall results as they relate to the entire multiple hurdle process and not an individual test. Therefore, a lot of the information is not relevant. So you may ask, why would we measure adverse impact for all three tests when the overall is all that matters? Well, this isn't the case. Legally and ethically, you're bound to look at the adverse impact at each level of the process, at each hurdle of the process, and use that information to ensure fairness in hiring, fairness in recruiting, and equity. So, what do you do when you find yourself in a situation with adverse impact within a test or across multiple tests? If you do not have a legal department or a lawyer available or an IO psychologist trained in this area, feel free to reach out. You can reach out to us through our contacts button, in which you can find several qualified consultants who can help you understand your situation and choose next steps.